Chapter 13. The kitchen was filled with the usual bustle of preparing dinner, with the crackling of the fire and the clanging of pots filling the air. Moira, the cook, worked skillfully, but her concentration shattered when a shadow fell across the work table. "Well, Moira, you have such skilled hands," Lachlan murmured with a crooked smile as he got too close. His tone was meant to be complimentary, but the gleam in his eyes betrayed far less innocent intentions. Moira tensed, her hands gripping the dough she was kneading. It wasn't the first time men like him cornered her with veiled insinuations, and experience told her that ignoring it would only make things worse. She tried to move away subtly, but Lachlan was quicker, his hand closing around her wrist in a firm grip. "Let me work, Lachlan," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Come on, woman, I just want to talk to you," he insisted, coming even closer, his breath reeking of liquor. Before the situation could escalate, a noise from the threshold caught their attention. Eilean had entered the kitchen upon hearing the struggle, and seeing the scene, her body tensed in immediate recognition of the danger. Her past had hardened her in these types of encounters, and she couldn't stand idly by while another woman endured what she herself had suffered in her marriage. "Let her go," she ordered, her voice cold. Lachlan turned with mockery, still holding Moira's wrist. "And what are you going to do, girl?" he taunted, releasing the cook only to focus his attention on Eilean. "You're brave to speak to me like that." Eilean stood her ground, her eyes burning with rage. She had learned not to back down from predators, even though fear gnawed at her stomach. "I have nothing to say to you, Lachlan." "Leave," she spat. The man let out a laugh, and with slow but determined steps he cornered her against the wall. His confident smile widened. "Come on, don't be so cold. I just want to keep you company." When he reached out toward her, Eilean instinctively reacted and pushed him away. But Lachlan, offended by the resistance, gripped her arms tightly and with a rough movement shoved her aside. The force of the push unbalanced her, and she fell to the floor with a gasp of surprise and pain. "You bastard!" a deep voice exclaimed before a dull thud echoed in the room. Gregor had appeared in the doorway just in time to witness the assault, and without a second thought he threw a punch straight to Lachlan's jaw. The impact immediately knocked him down, sending him crashing into a table before falling to the ground with a strangled groan. Silence thickened in the kitchen. Eilean, her heart pounding in her chest, placed a hand on her aching arm. When she looked up, she found Gregor's dark, fiery gaze fixed on her. It wasn't just fury burning in his eyes but genuine concern. With a determined gesture, Gregor crouched down and offered her his hand. Eilean took it hesitantly, still shaken. When he helped her up, he held her just a moment longer than necessary, his warm, firm fingers in hers. "Are you okay?" he asked in a rough voice. Eilean nodded weakly, but the emotion in her throat prevented her from speaking. No one had ever defended her before. No one. Moira, her face pale, looked at Gregor with gratitude, then at Eilean with eyes full of understanding. As Lachlan writhed on the floor, cursing under his breath, Gregor didn't take his eyes off Eilean, as if in that moment he silently promised her with no words that she would never be alone in her fight again. The rain fell in a soft yet steady rhythm, wrapping the castle in a veil of water and melancholy. Eilean pulled away from Gregor after that prolonged embrace, feeling the warmth of his arms vanish, leaving her exposed to the cold and uncertainty. As she lifted her gaze, her eyes searched his, trying to convey what words could not. It was the first time someone had defended her. Her parents had remained silent when her husband struck her. Her entire life had been shrouded in silence. But Gregor. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling that those two simple syllables were far from enough. Gregor watched her intently. He wanted to close the distance between them, to kiss her, to make sure she was truly all right, but he didn't know how to act after what he had done. He had let the worst part of himself take control, consumed by fury. If the king hadn't been there, he would have killed Lachlan in front of everyone. Slowly he raised a hand, and brushed his fingers over the cheek where Lachlan had struck her. His thumb traced the reddened skin gently, afraid of causing her more pain. A storm of indescribable emotions stirred in his chest. He wanted to tell her how he felt, to confess that he had never stopped thinking about her.
but the words lodged in his throat.
Shush. Gregor placed a finger over her lips, silencing her before she could continue. Promise me you won't stray far from me while we're in the castle.
Why?
Eilean asked, a hint of suspicion in her voice. I don't think Lachlan will let this go. I know him. Stay close to me. Eilean pressed her hands against her dress, unease settling in her stomach. But is that what you want? Gregor narrowed his eyes.
What do you mean?
Do you want me to stay close after everything that's happened? A small chuckle escaped him.
What do you think? Well, you got hit because of me.
I only defended my betrothed. It's my duty. A sharp pain pierced Eilidh's heart. Had he only done it out of duty? And everything that had happened between them, the kisses, the closeness, had that also been an obligation? Did you do it because it was your duty, or because you truly cared about what happened to me? Gregor clenched his fists. He couldn't bring himself to answer. A part of him feared showing vulnerability again, feared reopening old wounds. But Eilean was waiting, watching him.
You're not answering.
He cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze.
Just stay close to me.
Frustration flared inside Eilidh's chest. She took a step back, feeling as though Gregor had just hit her harder than Lachlan ever had. I thought you were different, but you're more like Lachlan than you think. You give orders and expect me to obey without question. You're in danger now, Gregor argued, already regretting his choice of words. But you won't answer my question. So don't expect me to obey your command. Before he could respond, Eilean turned and walked away, feeling her heart shatter into pieces. She refused to cry. Not for him. She had shed enough tears in her life. She needed to walk. She needed air. Something, anything to pull her away from the storm Gregor had ignited inside her.
But the rain was growing stronger.
And with it, the night fell quickly, dark, heavy and menacing over the forest. The weight of duty and the helplessness of love. The anger in Gregor's chest wasn't just rage. It was fear. It was the helplessness of seeing the woman he had loved challenge his protection, as if her safety didn't matter, as if he didn't matter. Gregor had spent his life leading men, protecting his clan, making decisions that ensured everyone's survival. But Eilean wasn't a soldier, nor a subject. He couldn't lock her away, he couldn't make her obey. And that destroyed him. Because if love meant seeing her choose her own path, even when he considered it a mistake, did he have the strength to accept it? Maybe honor wasn't about protecting her at all costs, but learning to trust her. Chapter 14. The rain pounded furiously against the muddy roads, shrouding Moira and Eilean in a grey mist as they hurried along. The young woman shrank beneath her cloak, trying to shield herself from the cold that seeped through her soaked clothes. The night was impenetrable, and only the distant lights of the village promised some form of shelter. I'll never forgive myself if you get sick because of me, Moira said, spotting the first houses in the distance. I won't get sick, Eilean replied through chattering teeth. Either way, we're almost there, the maid insisted. If you want, you can stay at my parents' house until dawn. Eilean shook her head, her gaze fixed on the road ahead.
No, I'd rather go back.
But it's night, and it's raining. Eilean shrugged with a faint smile. I've always liked walking in the rain, and I'm used to it. This is nothing compared to other things I've lived through. Besides, I need to clear my head. Moira watched her in silence, recognizing the sadness in her eyes. In that moment, she realized that Eilidh's life had not necessarily been better than her own, despite her higher status. Even so, she couldn't shake the guilt of having caused her trouble. "Milady, I wanted to thank you for coming with me, even at the risk of earning a harsh reprimand." Eilean offered a small smile. She knew that upon returning to the castle, Gregor would be furious with her for going out after Lachlan's threat.
But at that moment, she didn't care.
The warrior hadn't answered her question, and she had no intention of following his orders. Her defiance would likely earn her a scolding, possibly even from the king himself, but she only hoped no one had noticed her absence. Freedom and the desire to choose. Her whole life, others had made decisions for her. Her father, her clan, the king, even Gregor with his stern gaze and his orders wrapped in concern. But Eilean felt deep in her bones that her life couldn't be reduced to obedience. Did her freedom have to be sacrificed for the love of a man? Why did duty have to weigh more than her own will? As the storm raged around her, she understood that even though she loved Gregor, she couldn't allow his fear of losing her to become chains. Freedom wasn't just a right, it was her identity. And even if defying him meant facing his fury, she couldn't renounce herself.
No need to thank me.
I owed you. I feel guilty for what they did to you, because if I hadn't insisted with Lord Lachlan, he wouldn't have hit you. Don't worry, milady. You were right. I had too much to do in the kitchen, and couldn't take care of so many wounded. Eilean placed a hand on her shoulder, and pulled her slightly closer. I understand. Sometimes we're burdened with too many responsibilities, and when we fail to fulfill them all, we're the ones who get blamed. Moira glanced at her sideways, a hint of surprise in her voice.
Have you been hit?
Eilean offered a sad smile and nodded. Even though I'm engaged to Lord Mackenzie, I've been married before. And he did not treat me like a gentleman, because he knew I loved another man. Moira's eyes widened. Really? Who? Realizing she was prying too much, Moira stepped back and shook her head.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. It's all right.
I've always loved the man who is now my betrothed.
Lord Mackenzie? She asked, astonished.
Eilean nodded. Then you're very fortunate, because you'll marry the man you love. Eilean sighed and lowered her gaze.
I'm not so sure about that, Luck.
I don't think he feels the same about me.
But well, we must obey James' orders.
Moira sensed the sadness in her tone, and chose to remain silent. A few minutes later, they reached her home.
This is it, milady?
Eilean nodded and smiled at her.
I hope you recover soon, Moira.
Are you sure you don't want to come in and warm yourself a bit? Eilean shook her head just as a thunderclap rumbled above them, making her shudder. The night was turning so dreadful that she wished she could stay and take shelter, but the mere thought of Gregor's fury if he found out she hadn't returned to the castle convinced her to leave immediately.
It's better if I head back now.
Take care then, milady. And thank you very much for accompanying me. You're welcome. Eilean raised a hand in farewell, and turned her gaze back to the path. She wrapped herself tighter in her cloak and began to walk carefully. The ground was slippery, and she feared falling and getting herself all dirty. Some strands of her hair, escaping from the hood, were soaked and dripping onto her dress. If she didn't fall ill after this, it would be because an angel was protecting her from the cold of the night. Chapter 15. The rain fell with relentless fury, striking the trees and erasing the path beneath Eilean's feet. She struggled forward, drenched, her heart beating in time with the thunder. She could barely make out the way through the mist, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Gregor's silhouette emerged from the darkness, his cloak soaked, his face tight with concern. Without hesitation, he reached out his hand and helped her up. They rode together through the downpour until Gregor remembered a small cabin in the woods, an old but safe shelter where they could light a fire and wait for the storm to ease. A flash of lightning illuminated the abandoned cabin for an instant, casting long shadows on the worn wooden walls. The storm raged outside, making the trees creak and the rain drum insistently against the roof. In the dim light of the fireplace, Eilean could make out Gregor's face more clearly. He was more serious than usual, and for a moment she had the feeling he was trying to prolong the moment, as if each passing second were an excuse to be near her. Gregor, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the storm. The warrior lifted his gaze, and saw Eilean's hand extended toward him. The flickering firelight reflected in her eyes, a silent plea he couldn't ignore. He rose and slowly approached the rustic bed where she had taken refuge, sitting beside her curled-up figure. Does your ankle hurt a lot? He asked gently. Eilean nodded, and lifted her dress slightly, revealing the swelling that had already begun to deform the skin of her foot. Gregor reached out and carefully ran his fingers over the area, but the moment she let out a muffled whimper, he withdrew his hand at once. When he looked up, he noticed Eilean trembling. Her shoulders shuddered slightly beneath the soaked fabric of her dress.
You should take off your clothes, he suggested, his voice deep. You'll get sick if you stay like this.
Eilean looked at him in surprise, and Gregor was quick to clarify. There are some old sheets on the bed that can cover you while your dress dries. And if you don't mind, I'll do the same. I won't look, I promise. She hesitated, but the cold had seeped into her bones, forcing her to nod. Gregor stood and moved toward the fireplace, turning his back to undress. The sound of fabric brushing against skin filled the cabin as both shed their wet clothes. Gregor had to summon all his willpower not to turn around and look at her. The desire to hold her in his arms had only grown stronger since he had confessed his feelings. When the rustling of clothing ceased and silence settled between them, Eilean's voice broke the stillness. I'm ready. Gregor turned his head toward her. The fire's flickering light caressed her damp skin, giving it an almost ethereal glow. Her hair tumbled messily over her shoulders and down her back, making her look like a nymph emerging from a stream. Wrapped in a worn sheet, she clutched the fabric to her chest as if afraid he might take it from her. Gregor took a step forward, but the flicker of apprehension in her eyes made him stop. Gently, he said, I'd like to check your ankle. Eilean nodded, though a strange feeling settled in her chest. Since Gregor's confession, she felt as if her world had turned upside down. She didn't know what to do with her emotions or how to act. This was new to her, and the uncertainty of what Gregor expected from her after this moment terrified her. Gregor approached unhurriedly, sitting on the edge of the bed. With care he pulled the fabric aside to examine her foot, his expression filled with concern. When he pressed lightly, Eilean stifled a gasp of pain. It's twisted but not broken, he finally said. I can massage it to reduce the swelling before dawn. I didn't know you had that kind of knowledge, she murmured, searching his gaze. Gregor gave a faint smile. In war you learn everything to survive, he replied.
You'd be surprised to see me sew a shirt.
Eilean offered a faint smile, as Gregor began massaging her ankle with careful movements.
I haven't thanked you yet, she whispered.
Gregor looked up. For what? For saving me from the storm, for bringing me here, and for still loving me. Her words hung in the air between them, irreversible. Gregor felt his heart pound against his chest. I tried to deny it, he admitted. I punished myself for still feeling this way, but now that we're engaged, I don't want to keep rejecting what's in my heart. Eilean took a deep breath. I love you too, Gregor, she confessed. For a long time I hated myself for not having the courage to stand up to my father, and I hated you for not coming to rescue me. But neither of us is to blame for the fate that was forced upon us. Gregor moved closer, sliding a hand over her cheek. Now he could touch her without guilt, without remorse, without fear. Eilean was his, and for the first time in so long, he felt as if he had regained the part of himself he had lost. When I heard you had left the castle in the middle of the storm, he murmured, I thought I had lost you again. I couldn't bear it. Don't make me go through that again, Eilean. She shook her head and placed her hand over his. Gregor saw the glimmer in her eyes, the longing in her gaze. He understood her silent plea. And this time, he had no intention of resisting. The courage to be without masks. Sometimes Eilean believed that strength lay in silence, in the armor she built around her wounds. She convinced herself that shielding herself from pain would keep her safe, that if she never revealed her weaknesses no one could use them against her. Gregor had believed the same. But true courage wasn't in the shield, it was in surrender. In daring to be seen exactly as they were, with no certainties, no defenses, only the raw truth in their hands. When they allowed themselves that vulnerability, something powerful happened. The barriers fell, the armor cracked, and the possibility of a true connection emerged. Not because the other offered guarantees, but because by speaking from the soul, they created space for the other to do the same. In that honest exchange, without demands or expectations, true intimacy was born. They would be heard or not, understood or rejected, but at least they would have honored what they carried within. Because standing firm in their truth was not an act of weakness, but of deep emotional responsibility. It reminded them that they were not here to fit into the stories others expected of them, but to live their own with authenticity, without losing themselves to fear or the desire to please. Gregor clenched his jaw in a futile attempt to hold back, but when Eilidh let part of the sheet slip from her body, he whispered in a rough voice, "Do you know what you're doing?" Eilidh nodded with certainty. There was no doubt in her eyes or in her heart. She wanted this. She needed to feel that everything she had endured was behind her, and that now she had a future with Gregor. But above all, she wanted to erase any trace of David from her body. "I want to give myself to you." Gregor watched her, catching the fire that flickered in her gaze. He had imagined this moment for years, dreamed of tracing her skin with his fingertips, of making her his in body and soul. And now, with her bare before him, offering herself without hesitation, he had to summon all his willpower not to lose himself in the fierce passion consuming him. He knew Eilidh had suffered, that her former husband had hurt her in ways he preferred not to imagine. And he didn't want her to feel fear, didn't want her to think he would take her without care. So with all the tenderness he could gather, he closed the distance between them and kissed her gently. His hand slid to the nape of her neck, holding her with a softness that contrasted with the strength of his desire. The touch of his lips ignited a fire in Eilidh's blood. She felt the heat spread from the center of her chest to every corner of her being. Her skin burned under the warrior's caresses, and her body instinctively sought more. Gregor groaned as he felt her surrender to him, and with slow deliberate movements, he guided her until she lay beneath him. When Eilidh was fully reclined, Gregor took a moment to admire her. Her still damp hair fanned out over the pillow like a golden halo, and the flush on her cheeks fueled by emotion made him smile. "You have no idea how many times I've imagined this moment," he murmured, his voice thick with both desire and tenderness. "I have too," she admitted, feeling her skin burn even more under the intensity of his gaze. Gregor smiled at her shyness. With slow deliberate movements, he slid the sheet away, revealing her in all her nakedness. His hands roamed over her skin, caressing her with a devotion that made Eilidh shiver. His touch felt like embers igniting every corner of her body. "You've always been so beautiful," Gregor whispered. But she shook her head, averting her gaze. "I have scars now." Gregor frowned, letting his eyes travel over her skin, stopping at the marks he hadn't noticed before. With gentle reverence he traced them with his fingers, as if they were the most precious thing he had ever touched. "Did he do this to you?" Eilidh nodded, watching as Gregor's hands clenched into fists, struggling to contain the fury rising inside him. The weight of guilt crashed over him like a heavy stone. He should have been there to protect her. He should have stopped anyone from daring to mark her skin. But instead of giving in to anger, Gregor leaned in and pressed a tender kiss to each scar. Eilidh shuddered at the warmth of his lips against her flesh. The softness of his touch melted away any lingering doubt or fear. Her trembling hands explored Gregor's body, discovering with awe the scars that adorned his own skin. Battle wounds, silent witnesses of his past. Just as he had worshipped hers, Eilidh traced his with tenderness, memorizing every ridge and line. With a ragged breath, Gregor captured her mouth once more. His lips, his hands, his entire being adored her with a passion he could no longer contain. He moved over her with care, losing himself in the heat of her skin, in the intoxicating scent of her body, in the overwhelming sensation of finally holding her again. "I want you so much," he murmured against her lips. Eilidh arched beneath him, inviting him in, surrendering without hesitation. And with a tenderness that contrasted with the fire of his desire, Gregor gathered her in his arms and gave himself to her, the love that had bound them together despite time and distance finally finding its moment. The fire was still crackling in the hearth when Eilidh woke. For a moment she thought it was still night, but the dim light of dawn seeped through the cracks of the old cabin. She barely moved and immediately felt Gregor's warmth surrounding her, his steady breath in a slow, deep rhythm. Asleep, his face held a rare softness, one she seldom saw when he was awake, always hardened by the life of a warrior. With a mischievous smile, she let her fingers trace the contours of his cheek, then down to the rough stubble darkening his jaw, giving him an even wilder, more masculine air. Slowly her hand drifted lower, exploring the firm lines of his chest, descending toward his taut abdomen. She reveled in the freedom of touching him, without the ever-watchful gaze of the warrior, the one that never failed to make her nervous. But as she reached his lower stomach, she startled at how rigid it felt beneath her fingers. "If you keep going, you might find something that could surprise you." Gregor's voice rumbled in the dim light, hoarse from sleep but laced with amusement. Eilidh gasped, her eyes snapping up just in time to catch his smirk before he opened his eyes and fixed them on her. A scorching heat rushed to her cheeks. She knew she must be completely flushed when he let out a deep chuckle, and lifted a hand to stroke her face. "You were awake," she murmured, a hint of irritation in her voice, more from embarrassment than anything else. "I was wondering two things: how far you were planning to go, and what exactly was on your mind while you touched me." Eilidh huffed indignantly and tried to pull away, but Gregor's hands gripped her waist firmly, drawing her back against him. She glared at him with feigned outrage and struggled again to no avail. "I'm not letting you go until you tell me what I want to hear." Knowing there was no escape, Eilidh sighed and met his gaze before confessing, "I was wondering if you would ever truly forgive me for everything I did." Gregor smirked before flipping her over, pressing her down against him. She yelped in surprise, her blush deepening as she felt the undeniable proof of his arousal between her legs. "If I hadn't forgiven you, I wouldn't be doing this," he murmured before gripping her hips and squeezing them with relish. Eilidh barely had time to catch her breath before his hands roamed up her back, trailing over her bare skin. "Or this." He lifted himself slightly, capturing her lips in a slow, teasing kiss that made her shudder. She moaned involuntarily as his hands wandered down again, exploring her with barely restrained hunger. "Or this." With a wicked smile, Gregor drew her gently toward him and joined her slowly, as if every movement were guided by a silent longing. A soft breath escaped Eilidh, but Gregor caught her startled sound with a deep kiss, one filled with the same burning passion that had consumed him the night before. It hadn't been enough. He could never have enough of her uninhibited passion, of her scent, of the way she surrendered to pleasure so completely. No other woman had ever done to him what she had in just one night. And he needed her again. This time he let her take control, allowing her to set the pace. Eilidh loved him with the same intensity, pushing him toward a shattering release that had him groaning her name as she collapsed against his chest, utterly spent. "Is it always like this?" she asked, hiding her face against his neck. Gregor chuckled softly, stroking her back. "Have you ever experienced it any other way?" Eilidh fell silent. She couldn't answer. Instead she clung to him more tightly, letting the moment stretch between them. She knew she should say something, but dredging up those memories was too painful. "Eilidh," Gregor murmured, gently pulling her away to look into her eyes. She sighed, rolling onto her side before finally answering in a low voice, "The man I was married to, he would only hit me while. And he was always brutal." Gregor clenched his jaw, rage simmering beneath his skin at her words. He had always believed a man should never harm a woman, not even one who had wronged or humiliated him. "I suppose now it's my turn to ask if you'll ever forgive me for not coming to save you from that life." Eilidh offered a sad smile. "There's nothing to forgive. You didn't know. But fate took him out of my path. He's dead." Gregor pulled her into a tender embrace, resting his chin on the top of her head for a long moment. Then he leaned back to look at her. "How's your ankle?" "Much better. I think I can walk without too much pain." "Then we need to head back. They're probably already looking for us." Chapter 16. The door slammed shut behind Gregor, but he barely had time to react before a pair of firm hands grabbed the front of his shirt and shoved him violently against the nearest wall. His back hit the stone with a dull thud, knocking the air from his lungs. "I know I'm not your father, but give me one good reason not to rick your balls off and feed them to the dogs right now," growled a deep, furious voice. Gregor blinked, momentarily stunned by the sudden assault, and focused his gaze on Dougal's face. The warrior stared at him with a mixture of rage and relief, his fists still gripping his shirt with alarming force. The room was crowded, not only with his friends but also their betrothed, all wearing the same severe expression. Gregor exhaled before speaking, his tone calm despite the situation. "If you let go of me, I might have enough air left to answer you." Dougal hesitated for a moment but finally loosened his grip and stepped back, his eyes never leaving Gregor, as if he feared he might disappear again. Gregor smoothed out his shirt with a deliberate gesture and looked at his friends. "Try to understand, Gregor," Roderick said with a deep frown. "Knowing Lachlan is after you, how could we not worry?" "I know," Gregor replied sincerely. "If anything happened to Eilidh because of you, I'd be the one cutting off a certain part of your anatomy," Marjorie interjected harshly, earning a disapproving look from her fiancé. Eilidh stepped forward, glancing at everyone before speaking. "I believe I'm the one who should be apologizing," she began hesitantly. "Yesterday Gregor asked me not to wander off because of what Lachlan might do, but you did exactly the opposite," Finlay cut in with a huff.
"No surprise there, women."
Eilidh cleared her throat, uncomfortable. "Well, I was upset with him, and simply didn't think about the consequences when I accompanied the maid Lachlan had beaten back to her home. She said we should take the forest path, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away and think." "And why didn't you tell us before you left?" Cecily asked with concern, oblivious to the sideways glance Callum shot her. Eilidh shrugged. "I know. I should have trusted you, instead of isolating myself. I'm sorry. And I'm sorry for the trouble I caused. It seems that's all I'm good at." Her last words, tinged with sadness, made Gregor step forward and take her hand gently.
"It wasn't just your fault."
"It was mine too."
That's right.
Angus muttered, arms crossed. "You could have let us know you were going after her." Gregor frowned.
"Lachlan knew," he stated seriously. "I thought he'd say something." "That bastard,"
Finlay muttered under his breath, barely holding back a curse in the presence of the ladies. "And where the hell have you been until this morning?" Eilidh's immediate blush did not go unnoticed. Gregor saw her swallow hard and look at him for help.
"That's none of your business," Gregor replied sharply.
Callum raised an eyebrow. "I'd say you're in no position to refuse to answer after the night you've put us through." Gregor grunted, but seeing that everyone, even the women, were expecting an explanation, he finally relented. "I found Eilidh in the middle of the storm. We couldn't return because the road had turned to mud, so we took shelter in an abandoned cabin until dawn. If we had tried to come back, we would have risked our lives or my horses." "And what have you been doing all this time?" Rose asked from the back of the room, her voice seemingly innocent. The moment she felt the weight of everyone's stares, she turned crimson. Dougal smirked. "I suppose you've buried the hatchet after everything that's happened." Eilidh nodded, still flushed. "We've cleared up what happened between us years ago, and now everything is fine. In fact, I plan to speak with James about moving up our wedding." Eilidh turned to him, surprised. "You want to marry me now? Do you want to wait any longer?" Gregor countered with a smirk. Fear flickered in Eilidh's eyes. "I'm afraid my father will try something again to keep us apart." Gregor shook his head, cupping her face tenderly. "Years ago your father took advantage of the fact that I was just a boy. Now I'm a man, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure no one separates us." Eilidh felt her heart race, and without caring about their audience, she threw herself into Gregor's arms.
"Of course I want to be with you," she whispered in his ear.
Gregor held her tightly. "Then God help me, Because I love you too much to let anyone hurt us again." Around them, the others began to congratulate them. But in the shadows a pair of hate-filled eyes watched. And within, vengeance was already set in motion. Chapter 17. Eilean moved quickly to the chest, turning her back to the door. She knelt before it, carefully pushing aside the dresses covering the one her mother had prepared for her wedding. A smile formed on her lips as she gazed at it, remembering the moment she had hidden it deep inside the chest. That day, tears had accompanied her trembling hands, for the mere thought of binding her life to another man had made her stomach turn. But now joy flooded her. Gently she spread the dress over the bed to smooth it out, feeling her smile widen with every passing second. "My sincerest congratulations, Lady MacLeod." The voice behind her made her start. Eilean straightened quickly and turned toward the door just as Lachlan stepped inside and closed it behind him. Her heart pounded violently. She thought about screaming, about alerting anyone nearby, but when she saw Lachlan remain still by the door she hesitated. "What are you doing here, Sir Lachlan? This is my chamber." He smiled and took a step toward her. Instinctively, Eilean retreated, until her back pressed against the farthest wall.
"Well, I heard about your upcoming wedding, and wanted to congratulate you in person."
"Just you? I have no intention of sending my best wishes to your dear fiancé, if you don't mind." Eilean swallowed hard. She could sense the venom in his words from miles away. "I find it highly inappropriate, and in poor taste to enter my chambers uninvited." Lachlan let out a sharp laugh. "And did you invite Mackenzie?" Heat rose to Eilean's cheeks at the warrior's insinuation. "That is none of your concern. So if you don't mind, I ask that you leave my room at once." Without breaking eye contact, Lachlan took another step forward, his gaze raking over her body as if stripping her bare. A shiver ran down Eilean's spine, and upon recognizing what lurked in his eyes, she didn't hesitate to warn him. "If you don't leave, I will scream." Lachlan's expression softened into a lopsided smile. "Why would you scream? I thought we were friends." Eilean frowned. "Friends? Friends don't beat each other. You treated me like an animal." Lachlan kept advancing, until Eilean felt the cold stone against her back. He raised his arms, framing her face between his hands, trapping her. "Even in friendship, I always like to make it clear who's in charge." "You do not command me," she shot back defiantly, though inside terror clawed at her. Lachlan smirked and leaned in closer.
"What would happen if I wrapped my hands around your delicate throat right now?"
"You'd end up with my sword buried in your gut," said a voice behind him. Lachlan instantly stepped back, whipping his head toward the door. Standing there, hand resting on the hilt of his sword, was Ian McCrae, his expression fierce. "Lachlan, you have crossed too many lines in my lands and my castle," he said in a deep, measured tone. "You came as a guest because you accompanied the king, not because I have ever found you welcome. And yet I have given you shelter, you have eaten at my table, you have slept in my halls, and you continue abusing my hospitality by harassing the betrothed of one of my closest friends. This is the second time. For your own sake, I hope it is the last, because if you persist in tormenting her, not only will I banish you from my lands forever, but I will ensure the crows feast on your entrails. That is the only thing you are good for." Ian stepped forward and moved aside, clearing the way to the door. Lachlan held his gaze for a few moments silent, but in the end he turned and left the chamber without a word. Once they were alone, Ian turned his gaze to Eilean, who met his eyes with gratitude. "Thank you, Lord of Eilean Donan. If it hadn't been for you..." Ian nodded solemnly. "I am only doing my duty. Gregor is my friend, and I do not wish to see him suffer any more." Eilean hesitated before stepping closer, a touch of shyness in her posture. "Would it be terribly improper to ask you for something?" The warrior raised an eyebrow. "I'd prefer if you didn't tell Gregor anything." Ian seemed relieved by her request, but his expression hardened. "I can't stay silent. But I promise I'll do my best to convince Gregor not to attack Lachlan, for what he's done. You have my word. Eilean smiled at him in gratitude. Ian gave a slight bow and left, leaving her alone. The young woman collapsed onto the bed, trying to calm her breathing. Lachlan was a threatening shadow that seemed to haunt her even in the safety of her own room. Something told her she needed to stay alert. It wasn't over yet. Chapter 18. The last dinner before becoming Gregor's wife arrived sooner than Eilean had imagined. After the altercation with Lachlan Drummond, she met with her friends in the garden, and as they walked told them everything that had happened. Their faces showed surprise when she confessed that she had asked Ian not to say anything. She feared a confrontation between Gregor and Lachlan would erupt before the wedding. After that conversation, they all headed to the Great Hall for dinner. That was when Eilean truly noticed the bustle taking over the castle due to her imminent marriage. Part of her felt guilty that the clan of Eilean Donan had to handle the preparations instead of celebrating the wedding on the shores of Loch Ness, but she had to admit they were exceptionally efficient. The Great Hall where the ceremony would take place was already being decorated with care, fulfilling every one of her wedding dreams. As she entered, her eyes instinctively searched for Gregor, whom she had not seen all afternoon. When she finally spotted him, his hardened expression confirmed what she had suspected. Ian had already told him what had happened in her chambers. The tension in the warrior's shoulders was evident, and though he tried to ignore Lachlan's presence, his gaze briefly flickered toward him, meeting the same calculated indifference as always. Eilean made her way to the table, and took a seat across from Gregor, smiling at him sweetly. However, he only regarded her with grave concern. "Are you all right?" he asked as soon as she settled into her chair. "Did he hurt you?" Eilean shook her head. "No." Ian arrived and threw him out of the room. Gregor pressed his lips together before letting out a question, his voice tinged with irritation. "And why didn't you come to me?" Eilean sighed. "Precisely to avoid this. I didn't want you to be angry the night before our wedding." "Forget it. Nothing happened, and I'll be more careful with my door." Gregor frowned. "He could have hurt you. But he didn't, and I don't want James to be upset before the wedding," she whispered, pleading with her eyes. "Please, let's forget about it. Tomorrow we'll be married and leave this castle. Lachlan will be in the past." The warrior took a deep breath and after a few seconds nodded, his gaze intense. "And don't be mad at me, please," Eilean asked softly. Gregor studied her for a moment before a faint smile touched his lips. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in his. "You're right. I'm sorry. It's just that the thought of you being in danger drives me mad." Eilean returned his smile. "Now I have you to protect me. And you're the best." The glimmer in Gregor's eyes made her feel safe. She was about to say something else when James stood up, raising his cup. The entire hall fell silent, as the lord of the castle directed his gaze toward the couple. "I must admit that the reason for this toast still surprises me, as I never imagined either of you would want to move up your wedding. But it is an honor for me to announce that tomorrow morning, the union between Gregor and Eilidh MacLeod will be celebrated. I am glad to have reunited your fates, and I hope you will be happy in your new life." James lifted his cup. "Congratulations and long life." The voices of those present repeated the toast, although the king's warriors barely whispered the words, indifferent to Gregor's happiness. He, on the other hand, couldn't help but glance at Lachlan, who didn't even lift his cup. His gaze was fixed on Gregor, and in his eyes burned barely contained hatred. The warrior silently prayed that they could leave soon. If their stay in the castle lasted any longer, he was sure Lachlan would provoke a conflict that would end in war. Hours later, Eilean found herself in her room. The dinner had lasted longer than she would have liked, and she was so exhausted that she could barely stand. Tomorrow she would marry, and she wished to be well rested for the most important day of her life. However, James had insisted on hosting a ball in honor of the newlyweds, forcing her to stay awake late into the night. When they finally said their goodbyes, Gregor stole a long and passionate kiss that promised much more once they were husband and wife. Resisting the temptation to invite him to her room was difficult, but she reminded herself that soon she would have an entire life to relive what they had shared the night before. She removed the ochre dress and left it on the chair by the fireplace. Her long hair cascaded down her back, and her gaze fell on the wedding dress carefully placed on a chair. She sighed and looked out the window. The moon, partly hidden by clouds, seemed to foretell something uncertain. An unsettling premonition twisted her stomach. Then a noise behind the door startled her. Her heart raced, fearing that Lachlan was trying to stop the wedding. With trembling hands, she grabbed a shoe and approached slowly. She heard another sound, similar to a rustle, followed by controlled breathing. Her instinct told her she was not alone. Summoning her courage, she turned the doorknob and, without thinking, swung the door open forcefully, striking the crouching figure on the other side. A muffled grunt made her stop. On the floor, a cloak slid away, revealing a face she knew all too well.
What the hell?
Gregor rubbed his head, staring at her in disbelief. Did you just hit me with a shoe? Eilean blinked, confused. Me? And what are you doing here? I thought you had gone to your room, and someone was trying to break in to attack me. Gregor narrowed his eyes. And you thought you'd defend yourself with a shoe?
It was the only thing I had on hand, she justified, lifting the boot threateningly.
He snorted. I was here because I don't trust Lachlan. I wanted to make sure no one came near your door tonight. Eilean felt a lump form in her throat. She threw the shoe aside and hugged Gregor without saying a word. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. The young woman lifted her gaze and smiled. Do you want to come in? She whispered. The warrior hesitated.
What if someone finds us?
Tomorrow we'll be husband and wife. Does it matter? Gregor smiled and stepped over the threshold, closing the door with his foot. The night had just begun. Chapter 19. A wedding morning for Eilean. The castle woke up surrounded by a feverish activity. Servants came and went, putting the final touches on the decorations and preparing the chapel where, in a few hours, Eilean and Gregor would unite their destinies forever. The roses, carefully selected from the garden at the young woman's request, already adorned the tables and altar with their delicate fragrance. The bride's friends were also busy with their own outfits. The first to finish dressing was Marjorie, who had chosen a simple yellow dress that highlighted her reddish hair and deep honey-colored eyes. She styled her hair with small heather flowers, and after a final glance in the mirror, she left her room to help Eilean prepare for her big day. With an enthusiastic smile, Marjorie made her way through the castle halls. She felt a knot in her stomach, a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had seen her friend cry, fear her fate and doubt Gregor's love, but now all of that was behind them. Everything was set for Eilean to finally be happy. When she arrived at the bride's room, she energetically turned the doorknob and burst in. Good morning, she exclaimed cheerfully. But her voice died in the air when her eyes caught the scene before her. The bed was disheveled, and among the sheets a sleepy Eilean quickly sat up, trying to cover herself. Beside her, a lump stretched lazily, fixing a sleepy gaze on the door. It took Marjorie a couple of seconds to process the image, but when she finally did, her face froze. She stammered, taking a step back.
I thought I could help you get dressed.
I didn't think. Eilean shot her a pleading look.
Please don't tell anyone.
Marjorie's eyes fell on the clothes scattered on the floor, and a blush rose to her cheeks. I see, she murmured with a mix of surprise and teasing. Gregor grunted, sitting up with his bare torso exposed. His messy hair, and the hint of a smile on his lips gave him a carefree air. Now I understand Finley's constant frustration with his fiancée. Marjorie snorted, crossed her arms and gave him an exasperated look. I came to help my friend. I wasn't expecting to find this. I'm sorry, Marjorie, Eilean apologized. We fell asleep. I've noticed, the young woman replied with a mischievous gleam in her eyes. She turned toward the door but before leaving, tilted her head to glance at them over her shoulder with a mocking smile. I wonder how everyone will react when they find out about this. Eilean nearly shot out of the bed. You won't. Marjorie burst into laughter as she dodged the shoe her friend angrily threw at her.
Sorry, my friend, but this is too good to keep to myself.
With that said, she ran out before Eilean could hit her with another projectile. The door closed behind her, and silence returned to the room. Gregor sighed and lay back down on the bed, amused. Do you really find it funny that we were caught naked the morning of our wedding? Eilean asked, glaring at him. A little, yes, Gregor admitted with a teasing smile. But before your dear friend makes it public, I'd better get ready. And don't cry when you see me twist his neck. He leaned in to give her a quick kiss before putting on his shirt and escaping the room before anyone else found out. Once Eilean was alone, a playful smile spread across her face. Marjorie's expression when she found them together was priceless. Slowly she pushed the covers aside and got up. She walked over to the window and gazed at the overcast sky. The morning had started cloudy, but no bad omen could overshadow what would be the most important day of her life. She shifted her gaze toward her wedding dress, and a shiver of excitement ran through her body. Today she would marry Gregor. Today at last she could be happy. She only hoped nothing and no one would interfere with that fate. Chapter 20. An hour later, Eilean left her room, her heart racing as she headed to the chapel. She knew Gregor would be waiting for her there, along with the large family that her friends had formed with theirs. Her nervousness was evident, and in the end, she had needed the help of a maid to prevent ruining her hairstyle while decorating her hair with delicate flowers. When she opened the door, she was completely surprised to find Ian McCrae waiting for her, his gaze fixed on her.
Is something wrong? She asked, frightened by his serious expression.
A shadow of discomfort crossed the warrior's face, as though there was something hard for him to say. Finally he cleared his throat and in a whisper confessed. I thought I could escort you to the altar so you wouldn't walk alone. Eilean felt a wave of emotion, and a radiant smile spread across her face. She couldn't believe how this fierce-looking man could have such a noble heart. Without hesitation, she nodded, and accepted the arm he offered with chivalry. The only thing I ask in return, she said, glancing at him sideways, is that you treat me like you would a friend. If you're going to be my best man, we should set courtesy aside. Ian turned his head toward her, and for the first time smiled sincerely. All right, lass. They walked together down the hall toward the stairs. As they approached, the warrior muttered quietly. Gregor is a lucky man to have you back. Not all of us are fortunate enough to have fate return the one we once loved. Eilean glanced at him sideways, noticing the melancholy in his voice. However, his expression remained impassive, and though curiosity gnawed at her, she decided to remain silent. Instead, she gently tightened her grip on his arm as a gesture of understanding. Ian responded by pressing his hand over hers. It seems one of your friends has caused quite a stir among the others before entering the chapel, Ian whispered, with a hint of amusement in his voice. Apparently, she has some information about you and our dear dragon. Eilean's heart skipped a beat. Did she tell the king?
God, no, he denied with a slight smile.
But I was surprised to see Finlay speak to her, without a dagger in hand. Eilean laughed at the mental image.
Well, if that helps them get closer.
I doubt it, Ian replied with a smile before opening the chapel door. Gregor saw them enter and raised an eyebrow, surprised to see his friend escorting his fiancée. However, his attention quickly shifted to Eilean. Dressed in her elegant bridal attire, her beauty was almost ethereal. Gregor had changed his usual appearance, letting his hair fall loose and wearing a new kilt. His smile was the same as always, but there was a special gleam in his eyes. Eilean found it hard to breathe. She could only see Gregor, everything around her became blurry. She walked with steady steps, although the walk to the altar seemed endless. When she finally reached the altar, Ian shook his friend's hand and patted him on the back before retreating to the back of the chapel. The priest began his sermon, but Eilidh hardly heard a word. She only saw Gregor, and in her mind there was only the certainty that against all odds they were there together. Half an hour later, when the priest announced that they could seal their union with a kiss, the chapel erupted in cheers and applause. Ian had to intervene to calm the warriors, who were celebrating with euphoria. Eilidh felt embarrassed being kissed with such passion in front of everyone, but she quickly stopped worrying. She surrendered completely, returning the kiss with equal intensity. "In a few days you and I will be in this very place kissing Redhead," Angus whispered in Agnes's ear, who was sitting in front of him. The young woman shivered, but quickly composed herself and frowning, retorted, "I'd rather kiss a frog in this dress first." Angus burst into laughter. He didn't need to say anything more, he had long discovered how fun it was to make her angry. When Gregor and Eilidh pulled away, he gently caressed her cheek and smiled. "We're married now." Eilidh felt a lump in her throat and nodded, unable to speak. "I'm going to fulfill every promise I just made to you," Gregor whispered before James came over and gave them a hearty slap on the back. "Congratulations." Eilidh greeted everyone with a radiant smile. Finally, after all the suffering, the love she had felt since childhood was sealed before God. Nothing and no one could separate them. And as Gregor raised his voice to invite everyone to the celebration, Eilidh knew that, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she wanted to be. The warriors' laughter abruptly died down when Gregor stood up and scanned the room, looking at each face long enough for them to understand that his words were not a joke. "If I were you, I wouldn't be laughing so much," he said firmly. "In a few days, you'll all be in the same situation as I am." The echo of his words spread through the room like a cold blade. Some of the men furrowed their brows, while others tried to focus on their plates, avoiding eye contact as though they could push away the uncomfortable reminder. Their fiancés, on the other hand, looked at them with disdain, their contempt barely hidden. Eilidh, sitting next to Gregor, observed the scene closely before leaning slightly toward him and whispering, "It seems they still haven't accepted James's wishes." Gregor snorted and shook his head before replying quietly, "I have the feeling they only act like this in front of others. They're probably thinking something else inside." Eilidh didn't answer. Instead, she began serving herself food, enjoying the delicious aroma rising from the pots. However, her gaze drifted to the far end of the table, toward James and his men. They were eating calmly, paying no attention to the fiancés, as if the whole matter was completely foreign to them.
But there were a pair of eyes that did rise toward her.
Lachlan Drummond stared at her intently, his expression grave, almost angry. His apparent indifference was nothing more than a mask barely hiding his resentment, his fury, and something else, something that sent a shiver down her spine. Uneasy, she turned away and forced herself to focus on her plate. She didn't want to ruin the moment. That night, she had to be happy. Gregor, sitting next to her, ate slowly, observing the room with an expression that clearly showed his mistrust. And he was right to stay alert. The terror would come just an hour later. Meanwhile, at the edges of the castle, two figures moved stealthily in the shadows of the back courtyard. Owen and Murdo, men born in the nearby village, belonged to the same clan as the Laird of Eilean Donan, but their loyalty was not bound by blood, it was bound by gold. And they had already been paid in advance. "Do you think this will go well?" Murdo muttered, nervously rubbing his hands together. Owen spat on the ground and smiled smugly.
"It's a piece of cake.
We'll set the fire, and get back inside before anyone notices anything strange. The straw will catch fire quickly, and with the wood nearby, the flames will take time to be put out. When everyone runs to put it out, we'll take the bride. I saw her when I brought one of the trays to the hall. I know who she is. There won't be any problems." Murdo nodded, taking a deep breath. The thought of the gold in his pockets reassured him. And even more so, the thought of what they could do with the bride once they had her. Inside the great hall, the plates had been cleared away, and music began to fill the air. The sounds of flutes and bagpipes encouraged the guests to get up and dance. Eilean smiled with excitement, remembering the last time she had enjoyed a similar celebration by the shores of Loch Ness. Seeing her expression, Gregor suspected her intentions, and immediately shook his head. "No," he murmured almost pleadingly. "A few days ago you showed me you can dance really well. Or have you already forgotten when James made us?" she challenged him with a mischievous smile. Gregor snorted and leaned toward her, whispering in her ear in a low voice. "If you want me to dance with you, there's a condition."
"What is it?"
Eilean asked, narrowing her eyes suspiciously. "I'll tell you in our room, when all this is over," he replied, letting his warm breath tickle her neck. Eilean laughed, and tugging at his hand she pulled him to the center of the hall. They danced, jumped and spun in time with the music, letting joy surround them. But the fun was abruptly interrupted when the door to the hall swung open. Lachlan Drummond stormed into the room, with a look of urgency on his face. The music stopped instantly, and all eyes turned to him.
"What's going on?"
Ian asked, alarmed. "The straw," Lachlan panted.
"It's caught fire."
"We can't control it. We need more hands to put it out." Gregor frowned, his gaze immediately shifting to Owen and his men, trying to decipher if Lachlan was the cause of the interruption. But he saw him running with the king down the hallway, followed by the other warriors. "Go," Eilean asked Gregor. "I don't want to leave you alone," he replied, frowning. "Do you really think we'll stay here while you fight the fire?" Marjorie intervened. "We'll go for more buckets from the well," Eilean assured. "I promise we won't get close to the flames." Gregor clicked his tongue and sighed before giving in. He leaned over Eilean and kissed her in front of the others, who discreetly looked away. Then he ran toward the exit, leaving Eilean and her friends watching him. "Do you think it was set on purpose?" Eilean asked.
"It's possible," Rose said. "But by who?"
"No one has left the hall, not even Lachlan." Eilean felt a knot in her stomach, an unease she couldn't ignore. "Whatever the case, we must help," said Agnes, adjusting her cloak.
"Yes, we can't just stand here," Cecily agreed.
Eilean nodded.
"Let's go as soon as possible."
"If the fire is that big, they'll need all the help they can get." They hurried out of the hall.
But when Eilean was about to cross the door, she stopped with a huff.
"I forgot my cloak in the room," she said. "I'll go get it." "I'll go with you," Annabelle offered. "I won't be long," Eilean assured. "I'll see you at the well." She separated from them, and took the hallway leading to the stairs. The fortress was wrapped in an eerie silence, as everyone had rushed to the fire. She climbed the first step, and then she felt it. A fleeting movement behind her. She barely had time to turn around before a sharp blow struck her head. Everything went black. Chapter 21. The capture of Eilean. Eilean didn't know what had happened, or how long she had been on that horse. But when she opened her eyes, she could deduce it hadn't been long, as she could still smell the hay and burnt wood. They were still near the castle. Despite the sharp pain in her head, she turned her face slightly, and through the fog that clouded her vision, she saw they were nearing the edge of the forest. Why hadn't the guards seen them? Had they been allowed to leave, or were they not at their posts when her captors took her from the fortress? She knew it was two men as soon as she woke. One of them was in front of her, her head resting on his chest, and no matter how hard she tried to move away, all she achieved was intensifying the pain in her skull. Another rider was beside them, and although night was falling quickly, the little light that remained allowed her to see the scarf covering his face, decorated with the colors of Eilean Donan. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself not to lose consciousness. "We were lucky no guard was on the wall," said the man holding her on the horse. Feeling the vibration in his chest, Eilean tried to move again but barely managed to make a sound. An infernal burning coursed through her head, as if it were about to split in two. "Well, the little whore of Mackenzie has woken up," the other rider sneered, moving his horse closer to theirs. "Looks like your wedding is over." Eilidh tried to straighten up as he approached, but she could barely react before he grabbed her by the hair and shoved her mercilessly toward him. The rough movement almost made her fall off the horse, and a scream of terror escaped her throat, which caused both men to laugh. "Come on, Murdo, don't scare her too soon," said the man holding her with irony. "We need to get farther from the castle before we reach the designated spot." "Leave me alone." Eilidh found her voice and screamed with the little strength she had left. Owen let go of the reins with one hand and covered the young woman's mouth with the other, pressing it hard. "Lady MacLeod, if I were you, I wouldn't make a scene. You wouldn't want us to get discovered." Eilidh whimpered against his palm and tried to pry his fingers away with her own, but she only made him press harder and hit her head again. The slim chance of escape vanished with the searing pain that clouded her thoughts. Meanwhile, at the castle, the fire raged mercilessly. The warriors of Clan Eilean Donan, the king, his men and the other guests were working desperately to contain the flames threatening to devour everything. Servants ran back and forth with buckets of water, but it was like pouring drops on an uncontrollable blaze. "Damn it, this is hell!" Gregor roared as he threw another bucket of water. "I think it's crazy to try to put it out," Ian spoke with a mix of anger and discouragement. "Maybe it's better to let it burn out on its own." Gregor frowned. "Are you giving up, my friend?" Ian snorted. "Actually, I'd rather find the one who did this and throw them into the fire to burn along with the hay. But I don't see another solution." MacKenzie gritted his teeth and searched his memory for an answer. Then he remembered what had happened on the shores of Loch Ness years ago, when the mercenaries set fire to the barn. Lilius had come up with a method to extinguish the flames before they consumed everything. Inspired by that image, he looked at Ian and asked, "Do you have vinegar and salt?" Ian looked at him skeptically.
"What the hell for?" "It will put out the fire quickly. The same thing happened to us years ago, and we managed to save most of the grain." Ian didn't hesitate. "Bring all the salt and vinegar from the pantry." James approached with interest. "Will that really work?" "It worked for us," Gregor said. "Do you have any idea who could have done this?" James shook his head. "I've asked the men on the wall, but no one's seen anything suspicious." Gregor squinted and turned his attention to Lachlan, who was watching the flames from a distance. "Something tells me Lachlan is involved." James raised an eyebrow. "Lachlan? He's been with me the whole time." Gregor looked at him incredulously. "Don't defend him so much. You know he's not trustworthy." James sighed. "I understand you've had your differences, but this has nothing to do with it. In fact, he was one of the first to help put out the fire." Gregor wasn't convinced. Something didn't add up. Then a chilling thought crossed his mind. Eilidh isn't here. Gregor's heart raced. Without wasting a moment, he ran toward the women carrying buckets of water. "Is Eilidh with you?" Rose shook her head, concerned. "She went to her room to get her cloak." Gregor felt his stomach tighten. With a roar of fury, he announced, "The fire was a distraction. They've taken her." Chapter 22. Eilidh woke with a start. She felt a pair of arms gripping her tightly, lifting her off the horse. She tried to open her eyes, but a sharp pain was hammering her head so intensely that it made her stomach churn. She desperately wished she could empty her stomach, but even that was denied to her. Gregor. The image of her husband flashed in her mind as clearly as a lightning bolt. Had he been angry about her disappearance? The possibility that he might think she had abandoned him squeezed her chest. It had happened before, and if someone had made him believe the same this time? A knot of distress lodged in her throat, preventing her from screaming. Feeling herself being thrown over someone's shoulder like a sack, she squirmed in an attempt to free herself, but her hands were tied with a thick rope that dug into her flesh. The inverted position only worsened the dizziness and nausea, but she fought to stay awake. She needed to analyze her surroundings, remember every detail,
and find the smallest opportunity to escape. She had to go back to Gregor. She had to explain that she hadn't abandoned him. Finally, she managed to open her eyes. The night enveloped her in its black cloak, and although her position was precarious, she could make out the muddy path her captors were walking on. She lifted her head slightly, and saw a second man walking alongside the one carrying her. The pain in her neck forced her to lower her head again, but not before she made a decision. She had to try. She began to squirm and kick her legs while shouting,
"Let me go."
The men's laughter sent a shiver down her spine. Seconds later, she felt the brutal impact of her body hitting the ground. A cry of pain escaped her lips as she collided with the cold, hard floor. She tried to move, but the rope on her wrists prevented her. She lifted her head and looked around. An abandoned stable, barely illuminated by a couple of torches. The air was thick with humidity, and the stench of old straw. The men were still laughing.
"Who are you?"
she asked, struggling against the urge to vomit.
"What do you want from me?"
One of them crouched beside her and grabbed her hair tightly, forcing her to look up. Eilidh forced herself to stay conscious, as the dizziness hit her again.
"We don't want anything," the man said with a cruel smile.
"But you should ask him when he gets here. Though?" He scanned her body with his eyes. "After seeing you, maybe we'll find some fun." Eilidh slapped him away, provoking his laughter. She focused on their faces, on their clothes. She hadn't seen them before, but the colors they wore, they were from Eilean Donan. They were servants, or at least they seemed to be. One of them dragged her to a post in the center of the stable, and tied her hands around it. "If you touch a single hair on me, my husband will kill you," she spat bravely. The first man smiled and leaned close to her. "Do you need anything else, Lady MacKenzie?" Eilidh recognized him immediately. A servant from her own wedding. "You're servants of Eilean Donan." "The man who hired us has a lot of influence," Murdo said, while his companion laughed. "It was easy for us to pass as servants."
"And who hired you?" "That's a surprise, beautiful," they answered mockingly.
One of them slid his hand down her thigh, causing her to squirm in disgust. "Don't touch me." They both smiled, amused by her helplessness. "It was Lachlan Drummond, wasn't it?" One of them burst out laughing. "Your dear husband shouldn't have provoked him." Eilidh frowned, while her trembling fingers worked at the knot of the rope. "But you're from Eilean Donan," she insisted, buying time. "Everyone has a price," Murdo said with a malicious grin. Eilidh clenched her fists tightly, feeling the fibers of the knot give way under her fingers. She had to act fast. When Murdo leaned toward her, Eilidh freed her hands and in one swift motion used the rope as a weapon, hitting him in the face. The man fell back with a scream. Before the other could react, she struck him too. Without wasting time, she stood up and ran toward the exit. The coldness of the night surrounded her, but she didn't stop. She disappeared into the darkness of the forest, with only one thought in her mind, Gregor. Behind her, the men roared in fury. The chase had begun. Chapter 23. The night enveloped the castle in a cloak of shadows, barely dissipated by the weak light from the torches mounted on the walls. The breeze carried the scent of smoke and ash, remnants of the fire that had consumed part of the place. In the courtyard, Lachlan walked with an unconcerned stride, as if the flames that had threatened the fortress were little more than an insignificant incident.
"Is something wrong, Lachlan?
Can't you sleep?" Ian asked mockingly, watching him approach. Lachlan flashed a wide smile and shrugged with feigned nonchalance. "The truth is, I can't stand the smell that's left in the castle after the fire. I need to breathe some fresh air from the forest." Ian raised an eyebrow and let out a brief laugh. "Is that your excuse? What I think is that you'd rather go to the village brothel." Lachlan laughed softly, as if the idea didn't bother him at all. "I wouldn't rule it out, my friend. I've heard there are some very beautiful women there." Lachlan's casual gesture barely hid the flicker of anger that crossed his eyes when Ian called him, "my friend." Hiding his irritation, he nodded his head. If you want, I'll go with you. But Lachlan shook his head, suddenly hardening his expression.
It's not necessary.
I don't want you taking the prettiest ones. Ian smiled mockingly. We're in agreement on that. I'd do it in an instant. Lachlan pointed to the large door of the fortress. Open it. I need some fresh air. Ian nodded and whistled. A man, who had been waiting attentively for his orders, pushed the bolts and began to open the heavy wooden door. However, Ian's smile faded when he saw Lachlan leave with complete calmness, as though he wasn't abandoning the castle in the middle of the night after everything that had happened. I can't wait to break his face, Ian muttered when the traitor disappeared into the gloom. Next to him, Gregor, the loyal friend, nodded gravely. I don't understand how he can be so calm. I'll warn the others. Do you want me to follow him? Ian shook his head. I want you to stay alert. I don't trust leaving the castle unprotected. So you're in charge. Ian gave him a pat on the back before leaving. Good luck, friend. I won't return until Gregor's wife is safe among us. The warrior nodded, with determination. Ian swiftly mounted his horse and left the castle at a steady pace, trying not to raise suspicion. If Lachlan was still nearby, he risked being discovered. He took the same path his friends had followed hours earlier, and prayed he would reach them in time. Every minute that passed put Eilidh in greater danger. If Lachlan found her before they did, her life would be doomed. Chapter 24. Eilidh's escape. Eilidh tried to take a breath desperately, but the pain in her side made it harder and harder to breathe. She wasn't used to running like this, especially not in the middle of the night. She didn't know how much time had passed since she managed to escape from her captors, but she was sure it had been an eternity. This was without a doubt the longest night of her life. She had fled blindly, driven only by terror and desperation, not knowing where she was or where she was heading. Her hope had been to find shelter, a house or a village where she could ask for help, but nothing could have been farther from the truth. She was alone, completely alone, and she didn't even know if she had been running in circles all this time. The dampness of her sweat mixed with the mud that had splashed on her dress, making it heavy and sticky against her skin. She forced herself to take another breath, determined to run again, but her body no longer responded. Her legs trembled, her heart hammered painfully in her chest, and her muscles screamed in exhaustion. She needed to rest, though her mind urged her to keep running. The silence in the forest was deceptive. She had long since stopped hearing the voices of her pursuers, but that didn't mean she was safe. She remembered their shouts, their threats, the way they promised to do things to her that she didn't even dare imagine. That visceral fear had given her the strength to keep going, but now exhaustion was winning. She looked around, and found a hollow in the trunk of a tree large enough to hide in. Without hesitation, she curled up inside the natural shelter, huddling against herself as she tried to control her breathing. She hugged herself, trembling from both cold and fear, wishing she had her cloak to cover her. But at least she was still alive. The minutes passed with unbearable slowness. She raised her eyes to the night sky, praying that Gregor was near, that he would arrive before her captors found her again. Just the thought of what they would do to her if they caught her made her tremble even more. Then a sound froze her blood. "Where are you, you damned bitch?" Eilidh froze. The voice was too close. Her pulse raced as she curled tighter against the trunk, trying not to make a sound. She heard heavy, determined footsteps moving back and forth. For a moment, it seemed as if someone was right above her hiding place. She held her breath, fearing that even the faintest trace of her exhalation could betray her presence. "I hope you've hidden well, because when we find you, you'll wish you were never born." Eilidh clenched her lips tightly, resisting the urge to sob. She could feel the fear running through her veins like liquid fire, immobilizing her. "Damn it, where is she?" growled another voice. "I'm sure she hasn't gone far," came the reply. "We know these lands better than she does. We won't take long to find the damned woman of MacKenzie." "If Lachlan finds out about this," one of them said, his voice full of fear. "He won't find out," the other cut him off. "We'll find her before dawn and take her, even if it's with her neck broken. When we're done with her, not even Lachlan will recognize her face." The words were like a hammer blow to her soul. Eilidh squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the burn of tears against her eyelids. Never in her life had she felt such terror. Not even her former husband had made her fear like this.
But she knew those men weren't just after her.
They also wanted to hurt Gregor. She bit her hand to silence the sob that threatened to escape. Only when she heard them move away was she able to exhale the air she had been holding in her lungs.
But the fear didn't leave her.
She stayed hidden, curled up in her shelter, until exhaustion finally overtook her completely. She didn't know how long she had slept, but when she opened her eyes the sky was beginning to lighten with the first rays of dawn. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized she had lost valuable time. She mentally scolded herself for falling asleep, for not continuing to flee as soon as her pursuers had moved away. She listened carefully, trying to pick up any suspicious sound. When all she heard was the distant murmur of a waterfall, she dared to leave her hiding place. Her body protested with sharp pains when she stood, and had to stretch to relieve the stiffness in her numbed muscles. She looked around. Everything seemed calm. Without wasting time, she returned to the path, though she had no idea where she was or where she was going. She walked for over half an hour, guided only by the sound of the water. Then suddenly, a horse emerged from the bushes, its rider stopping abruptly in front of her. Fear pierced her chest when her eyes met Lachlan Drummond's. The man watched her with an expression of cold satisfaction, tilting his head slightly before smiling maliciously.
"Oh, what a shame.
Your wedding dress has gotten dirty." Eilidh felt her fate was sealed. This was the day of her death. Eilidh's scream shattered the silence of the forest. Her instinct urged her to retreat, but Lachlan was faster. In the blink of an eye he dismounted from his horse and lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a force that made her gasp in pain. "You won't escape this time," he whispered, the edge of his dagger grazing her throat. But before he could harm her, a furious roar rumbled through the trees. A whirlwind of fury and steel emerged from the dense thicket, and Lachlan barely had time to turn when Gregor launched himself at him with the fierceness of a warrior ready to kill. The clash of swords echoed in the air. Gregor struck with force, forcing Lachlan to release Eilean and retreat. The young woman fell to her knees, pressing a hand to her neck where the dagger had left a burning trail. But her eyes never left the scene unfolding before her. Gregor and Lachlan faced off in a fierce duel. The blades flashed with each strike, the grunts of effort and the clashing of metal creating a deadly symphony. Lachlan was fast and clever, but Gregor surpassed him in strength and determination. With every thrust, with every blow, the anger of the warrior was palpable, the fury accumulated from all the harm this man had caused. "Eilidh, run!" Gregor grunted through his teeth, never taking his eyes off his enemy. But Eilidh couldn't move. She knew that this wasn't just a fight, but the inevitable conclusion of a story of hatred and vengeance. Lachlan saw an opening, and attacked with surprising speed. His sword grazed Gregor's side, tearing through fabric and skin with a shallow cut, but enough to draw a grunt of pain from him. However, instead of weakening him, the pain only fueled his fury further. With a roar, Gregor spun on his heels and launched a downward strike. Lachlan barely managed to stop it, but the impact made him stumble. Taking advantage of his loss of balance, Gregor pivoted the sword, and with one final precise thrust, the blade sank deep into his enemy's chest. Lachlan gasped, his eyes widening in disbelief. He coughed, a bubble of blood staining his lips as his body collapsed to its knees. Gregor held his sword firmly, watching his enemy fall to the ground. His chest heaved with difficulty, his breath ragged from the intensity of the fight. Eilidh let out a stifled sob, covering her mouth with her hands. Lachlan tried to say something, but his breath faded before he could speak. His eyes remained fixed on an empty point, his body finally surrendering to death. Gregor stood still for a few moments, his chest still heaving, until he finally let out a heavy sigh. His eyes rested on Eilidh, and seeing her safe, the tension in his body began to dissipate. Dawn painted the sky in pale hues as Gregor lifted his gaze from Lachlan's motionless body. The morning breeze carried the scent of the damp forest, while the echo of battle slowly faded with each ray of sunlight filtering through the treetops. Around him, the warriors who had fought against Lachlan's men drew near, exhausted, breathing heavily, searching their leader's face for a sign. But Gregor did not raise his eyes. He kept staring at the blood that still stained his sword, a dark red starkly contrasting with the cold gleam of the steel. Eilidh, a few meters away from him, clung to her own body, trying to control the trembling that shook her. She could still feel the burning line on her neck where Lachlan's sword had grazed her skin. Her dress was soaked with sweat, mud and blood, and although her body demanded rest, her mind still resisted accepting that she was safe. Her eyes searched for Gregor, needing to see him, to make sure he was still there, that he wasn't a hallucination brought on by her fear. The warrior sensed her gaze before turning. When their eyes met, full of distress, he closed the distance between them in 2 strides and held her by the shoulders with a firm yet gentle strength. "Eilidh," he murmured, lowering his head until their foreheads touched. She let out a sob and closed her eyes.
"I thought you wouldn't come," she whispered, her voice broken.
Gregor barely smiled and held her face in his hands, gently tracing her cheek with his thumbs, wiping away the traces of tears. "Don't say nonsense. I would always come for you. Always." Before she could respond, he tilted his head and kissed her. It was a desperate, intense kiss, filled with relief and rage, but also with the promise that nothing and no one would ever separate them again. Eilidh responded with equal intensity, feeling the weight of terror begin to fade. Her fingers clung to the fabric of his shirt, seeking to anchor herself to reality, to him. A discreet clearing of the throat forced them to separate. Ian McCrae was watching them with an arched brow and a half-smile on his lips. "Gregor, if you're done making sure your wife is still in one piece, we need to decide what to do with the bodies." Gregor huffed and nodded, though his hands lingered at Eilidh's waist before letting her go. He looked at her face one last time, then with a barely audible whisper said, "Don't go far from me." Eilidh nodded, as she didn't want to either. Not after everything that had happened. The warriors began to move the fallen bodies, leaving Lachlan's aside, as if he didn't even deserve to be collected with the others. Gregor looked at his corpse one final time, making sure he would never threaten his wife or his clan again. Then with one last glance at Eilidh, he mounted his horse and offered her his hand. "Let's go home." Eilidh took his hand without hesitation, and let him lift her onto the saddle in front of him. Gregor wrapped his arms around her, ensuring she was safe against his chest. As the group set off, she rested her head on him, closing her eyes and allowing herself for the first time in a long while to feel that the danger was behind her. Chapter 25. The wind whipped around them, violently moving his cloak and hair. Everything had ended much sooner than expected, and in a much simpler way than he had imagined. He thought Lachlan would have more men with him, but in the end his wife and all the suffering they had endured had been avenged. Now all that was left was to rest beside her, and return home as soon as possible. "Tie him to one of the horses," Ian ordered, being the first to react.
"We'll take him back to the castle so that James can do whatever he wants with his body."
Upon hearing his voice, Gregor reacted and lifted his gaze from the ground. He met Ian's eyes and silently thanked him for coming after them, for warning them and for helping. With a slight nod, he set off to find the horses. "Gregor." Eilidh whispered his name in a barely audible voice. The warrior turned towards her just in time to catch her in his arms. The young woman threw herself at him, wrapping around him tightly. Gregor felt her tremble, as he pulled her by the waist and drew her against his body. Finally, he had her in his arms after the worst night of his life, not knowing where he was or in what condition she had been. He inhaled her scent. This time she didn't smell of flowers but of damp earth and fear. He didn't want to imagine what his wife had suffered, but he swore to himself that he would be more attentive in the future to spare her from more pain. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," Eilidh murmured against his neck, clinging to him even tighter. Gregor smiled tenderly. "And why wouldn't I come? I thought they'd leave you a note with my name, saying I left you again. I feared you'd believe them this time. Gregor let out a soft laugh, and hugged her even more tightly, before pulling her slightly away to take her face in his hands and look her in the eyes. Never think that again, please. Whenever you leave, I'll come for you. I'll never allow others to decide for me. I know what I want, what I desire, and it's you. No matter where you are or with whom, I will always find you and bring you back home. Eilidh's eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. She nodded, unable to speak. Gregor smiled at her tenderly, and gently wiped away her tears before hugging her again. I love you, Eilidh MacLeod. I always have and I always will. Eilidh sobbed but managed to pull herself together enough to respond. I love you, Gregor MacKenzie, from the moment our eyes first met. A sarcastic grunt interrupted the moment, followed by Angus' voice. If I ever get this sappy, please kill me, he said to Finlay.
It would be my pleasure.
Gregor smiled and stepped away from Eilidh to look at his friends. I'd like to see you two, at the feet of your fiancés. Finlay snorted. I think I'd prefer to end up like this miserable bastard, he said, pointing to Lachlan's body. I'm thinking of fleeing the country, Angus added. Eilidh smiled as she watched them head toward their horses, to begin the journey back to Eilean Donan Castle. Then she looked at Gregor and said, They're crazy about them.
Yes, but give them time to realize it, he replied before guiding her to his horse and helping her mount.
When Eilidh felt Gregor settle behind her in the saddle, she turned her head slightly and asked, When will we go to the shores of Loch Ness? I'd like to return to the place where I was born, though it saddens me to part from the girls. Gregor rested his chin on her shoulder and whispered in her ear. We'll go when our wedding night is over. After an entire night not knowing whether she would live or die, the idea of surrendering herself into Gregor's arms was too great a temptation. She leaned her back against the warrior's strong chest and replied,
I hope that's soon then.
Gregor grunted against her ear.
As soon as we get to the castle.
More than an hour later, they saw the castle in the distance. Eilidh sighed with relief, yearning for warmth and the chance to rid herself of the dust and dirt, not just from her dress but from her body and hair tangled behind her. She felt nervous thinking about her friends, and the king's reaction upon seeing them return with the traitors' bodies tied to the horses. She didn't want to look at the corpses, just imagining it made her stomach churn. She knew James would demand explanations, but she was willing to do whatever was necessary to protect Gregor and the others from the king's wrath. The first to spot them was the tower watchman, who immediately gave the order to open the gates. One by one, the warriors entered. Seconds later, James appeared through the castle door, accompanied by his men.
What the hell happened at Eilean Donan? He demanded, locking his gaze on Lachlan, who was being dragged by his horse. What have you done with him?
My lord, Ian said after dismounting, I think it's better we speak in private. There's much to explain. But James shook his head firmly, too angry to listen to reason.
I think we need to talk right here.
And you? He turned to Gregor. Why the hell did you leave without warning us? Gregor took a step forward to respond, ready to face the king. However, Eilidh placed a hand on his arm, asking for calm, and she stepped forward herself. I was kidnapped by Lachlan's orders, my lord. They confessed before they died. When I escaped, he tried to kill me. My husband and the others did what they had to do to save me. James studied her intensely before turning his gaze to Gregor. You have an extraordinary woman by your side. I hope no one tries to take her from you again. Gregor gave a confident smile. Whoever tries will die. James nodded slowly. Finally, it was all over. Epilogue. Meeting at Loch Ness. There are desires that burn hotter than fire, and loves that hurt more than the sword. Anonymous. The waters of Loch Ness stretched calm and dark under the faint light of dawn. Aboard the small boat gliding silently toward the shore, Eilidh shivered, not only from the biting cold against her skin but also from the wave of emotions that overwhelmed her as she returned to her homeland. Her hands trembled in her lap, fingers frozen, unable to still the restlessness boiling inside her. At least she was grateful for the light mist, which allowed them to navigate without the risk of straying from the Mackenzie clan's harbour. Beside her, Gregor rowed with practiced ease, his expression serene, though in the depths of his eyes gleamed an emotion only Eilean could decipher. Days ago he had insisted that the warriors of Eilean Donan return to their lands without them. He didn't want to take advantage of the hospitality of his great friend Ian, to whom he had promised a visit soon, and whom he relentlessly pushed toward a marital future. "I'd have to be mad to let a woman sleep in my cot," Ian had told him, laughing before shoving him toward his horse to avoid further discussion. The memory brought a smile to Gregor's lips. Saying goodbye to his friends had been overwhelming, and though he knew he would miss them, his home was Urquhart with his best friend Tavish. But above all, it was with Eilean. Those days by her side had been the best of his life. They had healed old wounds, cleared misunderstandings, and ensured that nothing and no one would come between them again. Eilean took a deep breath as the castle appeared in the distance, rising majestically atop the hill. Her eyes grew misty. It was as if time had stood still. The harbour, the winding path leading to the fortress, the forest embracing it, everything remained unchanged. A sudden desire struck her, to visit the lake where she had so often found Gregor before he left. Would it still be the same? "What are you thinking about, to look so serious?" Gregor's voice pulled her from her reverie. Eilean blinked and shook her head, offering a small smile. "I was wondering what Tavish is like now, and how he'll take my return. Maybe he won't even want to see me." Gregor shook his head, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Forget whatever you've heard about him over the years. I'll explain everything, and I know he'll accept you. And Lilius too. Though, I admit, I have my own reasons to be nervous about returning to the castle." "Why?" Eilean asked, curious. "Because I mocked Tavish too much when he fell in love. Now I'll have to eat my words," he confessed with a grin. Eilean burst into laughter as Gregor docked the boat and secured it to a log on the shore. "The luggage stays here. I'll send someone to fetch it later," he instructed. "Do you think they're expecting us?" "I'm sure the lookouts saw the boat and recognized me. Besides, Tavish will be keeping an eye on the lock." Eilean twisted her hands nervously again. Gregor pulled her toward him and placed a kiss on her forehead. "Calm down. Everything will be fine." She nodded, though not very convincingly, and together they began their way to the castle. Gregor intertwined his hand with hers, offering her support. Eilean looked around in astonishment. Everything was the same as when she had left. Only the faces had changed, but some even seemed familiar. The warriors stationed on the wall looked at her with expressions of surprise, confirming her suspicion that they remembered her too. The castle doors opened, and Eilean forced herself to control the trembling in her hands. "I'm with you, Eilean," Gregor murmured with a smile. "I won't leave you." She squeezed his hand tightly, seeking support. And then she saw them. At the top of the stairs, Tavish and Lilius were waiting for them. The expression on the laird's face when he recognized them was so astonished that Gregor had to stifle a laugh. Tavish squinted and crossed his hands behind his back as he watched them approach. His nervousness was palpable, though he tried to hide it. "Why do you look so surprised?" Lilius asked curiously. Tavish snorted. "It's been a long time since these men saw a beautiful woman." Lilius shot him a glare. "Well, thanks." Tavish glanced at her sideways and smirked. "You don't count. They know I'll rip their eyes out if they look at you too much." Lilius snorted, before turning her attention back to the couple. Seeing Gregor holding Eilean's hand firmly, she raised an eyebrow. Her gaze landed on Tavish just as he muttered in disbelief. "It can't be." The laird stepped down a stair and fixed his gaze on Eilean, as if afraid it was an illusion. Gregor widened his smile, and 2 meters away he stopped. "What the hell is this, Gregor?" Tavish could hardly take his eyes off Eilean. Gregor cleared his throat and spoke calmly. "I'd like to introduce you to my wife, Eilidh MacLeod." Lilias stifled a gasp of surprise and happiness, while Tavish, speechless, stared at his friend in disbelief.
"Your wife?" he repeated, unable to process it.
Without warning, he moved toward Gregor and grabbed him by the doublet, shaking him forcefully.
"What the hell have you done?
Marrying her? Have you gone mad?" Gregor laughed.
"It's all explainable.
If you let me in, I'll gladly tell you." Tavish shook him again. "It better be a good explanation, or I swear I'll make you swallow your own balls." Finally, after Lilias's intervention and Eilidh's heartfelt confession, Tavish snorted and kissed her hand in a welcoming gesture. "Welcome back to the shores of Loch Ness." Gregor patted his back.
"That took you a while to say, huh?"
Tavish growled. "I'm going to hit you anyway.
But first, give us something to eat."
"We're starving," Gregor joked. Laughing, the friends entered the castle, followed by Lilias and Eilean. For the first time in years, Gregor felt that his soul was at peace. And in his heart he knew that at last he was home. The love that transforms. Love was not just a fleeting emotion, or a desire that ignited and faded with time. It was an act of surrender, a commitment to oneself and to another. But to receive it, one had to be willing to change, to let go of past wounds, to stop clinging to what had kept them in solitude and distrust. Gregor and Eilean had to walk a path of loss and redemption, a struggle between pride and the need to love. They learned that true love was neither a battle to be won, nor a territory to be conquered. It was a voluntary surrender, the acknowledgement that while they could survive alone together, they could truly flourish. Only when they stopped fighting their own hearts and dared to look at each other without fear or resentment, did they find what had always been there, a love that sought not to possess but to set free. A love that demanded not perfection, but authenticity. Love transformed when one stopped running from it. When they dared to embrace it in all its strength, with all its risks, with all its power. Because true love did not turn them into someone else, it returned them to who they had always been destined to be.